Dr. Kipp Antonio, and with me is Keith McIntosh. We are the social scientists. Today we're going to be talking about Sam Harris. We're going to be going over his views on religion, his views on meditation, his views on logic and lying, and finally his views on politics and Trump. So, Keith, you recently saw Sam Harris.
In the flesh.
Wow. What was that like?
He's been going on a speaking, he's doing that. You listen to his podcast quite a bit, right, Kipp?
Yes, I do.
So, he's going around and talking live in all these different theaters around the country.
Absolutely.
So he went to Philly. Philly's not it's not hip New York, but it's still on the East Coast and is big enough that he finally made his way here. And I live in Philly. So in fact, I walked to the place. It was freezing cold, felt like -20. A giant line of nerdy white men about my age were standing in the freezing cold.
Wow.
And I went to the back of the line. I tapped somebody on the shoulder. I said, "Is this Sam Harris?" And he said, "I hope so." The guy in front of me said it was for Sam Harris. So there were all these nerdy people, shivering outside for, 40 minutes. And then finally we were led into the theater. And there were two women who conducted the podcast along with Sam. I forget their names. And it was a fine evening. It was okay. Actually, there were a lot of kind of everybody who sat around me. Sam's great, very smart. He's got one of those very computer brain kinds of thinking. His intellect is that way. Everyone who sat around me in the theater were douchebags. Were really unpleasant to sit with.
Okay, what made them douchebags?
Like a beer rolled under my feet, and then somebody was just yelling for it. Another kid asked a question at the end. His question was kind of dumb, but whatever. He's it's the public, and this guy next to me yelled basically shut up and sit down. He was so annoyed by the dumb question, which just seemed rude. And the other guy next to me is kind of on his cell phone the whole time. A lot of people were on their phones, which seemed crazy. You pay decent money to see Sam Harris. And I left with the feeling that I imagined everyone in the audience would be kind of sophisticated and thoughtful. And I left with the impression that they all have Asperger's and they're all a little douchey, which really? I don't know what that. Now that's not a accurate sample of Sam's audience.
Right.
But it did leave me with a different impression. Take that for what it's worth.
Are you sure that's just not a standard Philadelphia crowd? There's just something that happens to Philly people when they get into a group.
It's probably true. The Super Bowl is tomorrow, and honestly, I think the city is going to be smoking ruins. Philadelphians have a way of getting too excited.
That's funny. All right, so let's get right into it. So you saw him speak, you saw him in the flesh. But you know what the cool thing about you, Keith? Keith, I think you can proudly claim that you are a Sam Harris hipster. You have been into Sam Harris,
long before it was cool.
Since undergrad, right?
That's right, yeah.
So we're talking going all the way back to 2006, 2007. Is when you were first. I remember you talking about Sam Harris and meditation and Sam Harris and being a new atheist way back there. That was 12 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty wild.
Yeah. He wrote Letters to a Christian Nation. I don't know if I read that, but I think he was on my periphery, and then he wrote The End of Faith, and that kind of put him on the map. But as soon as that was happening, I was on board and super impressed with him. He was really critical of religion, which I thought was fascinating. I think growing up in Michigan, there's a lot of fairly conservative folks and people who religion is a huge part of their lives. So it was just kind of interesting to me to hear somebody so strongly criticize religion. So I was a big fan of his and thought that he might kind of fade away in time. But then he kind of hooked up with Christopher Hitchens, who I'm a huge fan of, Daniel Dennett and Richard Dawkins. And they became the four horsemen, talking the new atheists, so-called new atheists. And that kind of launched him into another level. And again, I thought he may fade in time, but there's been these, I guess it was a few years ago now, with Ben Affleck on Bill Maher's show. There was a little scuffle, and it's kept him in the spotlight for, a long time. And this podcast now is hugely successful. So he's still maybe not a public intellectual, because I don't know if those exist anymore, but the closest thing that we have to one.
Yeah, I would say he is. Yeah, I would say he's a public intellectual. I wouldn't put him on Neil deGrasse Tyson levels, but he's darn close. If you go and look up, him, Noam Chomsky, which he wouldn't like being paired with. like Neil deGrasse Tyson, was it Lawrence Krauss? Like, I mean,
Yeah,
those
Krauss.
guys, like, they kind of are like the touring people. They're, when you go to a college campus, like, they fill the arenas, you know?
That's right. That's right.
Okay. So, well, you started talking about his views on religion. So, Keith, can you give like a little, I mean, we both kind of know his views on religion. It's probably his most outspoken topic, but let's start with maybe his views on Christianity. Is that a good place to start?
Sure. I mean, his whole thing is he's like a hyper rationalist, which is odd because he also combines that with deep spirituality. Like he's very much into Buddhism and meditation and mindfulness. But essentially, he takes any sort of mythic story as a myth, and religion is, no exception. So the stories of the Bible he understands to be truth claims, and he finds them, phony. And so essentially, like any belief that's not rational or doesn't stand up to rational scrutiny, he thinks is garbage and kind of tosses aside. And he wants to build a morality that's internally coherent and based on reason.
Right.
Does that sound about right to you?
Yeah, I think so. Do you think that there's like an underlying anger he feels toward religion? And maybe, I don't mean necessarily like kind of like a simplistic, like, oh, I hate going to church, so now I'm going to be an atheist. I mean kind of like, when I listen to him, I almost feel like there's like this deep-seated anger in how religion has held back humans. In the same way Christopher Hitchens had that same type of anger, right? Like he was frustrated that people spend their time and their lives focused on religion rather than, rationality or making the world better or community or development of like a moral, like an internal moral structure that isn't tied to like the death of somebody 2,000 years ago.
Yeah, I do. I mean, but I don't know quite how to, I think he's a wise enough person that it's not like festering resentment. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think he's like when I hear the word anger, I think of like a kind of caveman anger. And he's like such a cerebral person. I don't know if I would necessarily say it that way, but I do think that he is, he almost seems, sometimes I wonder if he is a little like Asperger's or if he's on the spectrum. I think you may feel this way as well. He's so damn rational. And that's fantastic because he's brilliant. But I do wonder sometimes if there's a weird kind of like, if he doesn't quite get it in a way, whereas like normal people with, normal IQs and a different sensibility, maybe they get something from religion that he doesn't quite grasp. Or maybe that's not the right way to put it, that he doesn't grasp. I think he gets it. But it's just like, I think sometimes he's on a different plane than most people. And maybe that makes his analysis technically true, like rational and coherent, but somehow still wanting.
Or he just doesn't feel it as deeply. Like he kind of gets what people get from it, but he doesn't maybe understand like the level of depth in which that ingrains itself in somebody's heart. Maybe it's like a way of saying that. But there's something, there's that he's hyper analytical when it comes to religion. And I can see if you're a hyper analytical person, it's very easy to like deconstruct religion very quickly. You know what I mean? And just to go like, there's no evidence. This doesn't make sense. But he doesn't always like paid heed to the cultural or emotional strength maybe that people draw from religion, right? I'm not really sure, but he also oh, go ahead.
Well, I think he sees it as dangerous. I think that's the reason, like, because it's like this emotional wishy-washy area. He sees that as a place where, terrorist beliefs can fester, and he's very much focused on the corrosive, negative side of religion, which is a very real side of it. But there is like, within Christendom or within a caliphate, there's essentially unity. Religion has been a force to unite people in a really profound force. And on the edges of civilizations where two touch, there's conflict and war. And so you can think of like the Crusades or something like that. I think Harris is more focused on that conflict. And today, I guess, terrorism and American, foreign policy or the colonial Western powers is like the modern version of that, as opposed to focusing on the unity within a belief system, which I think someone like Jordan Peterson is interested in.
Right. I also think so. The unification piece of religion, I think, is like a good point that maybe Sam doesn't adhere to, or maybe he does and he just dismisses it. He would say like, there's a lot of things that unify people that aren't that. They don't necessarily need to connect to that. The other thing though is I always think about this thing I guess I like to call like the invisible data, and maybe I'm just thinking about it right now because I just listened to Dan Carlin talk about torture for a couple hours on the Hardcore History podcast. But Dan Carlin is talking about how torture, like a big part of it, is to prevent other crimes from happening.
Ooh.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's like you send somebody into the Coliseum and they have to, fight a lion knowing that they're going to lose. Then they get killed by a lion, and then that prevents murders from happening because everyone sees this guy die by the hands of a lion, and then you think, well, I'm not going to necessarily, go kill anybody because if I do, I'm going to get, fed to the lion pit. I think that religion probably also serves the same purpose in a way, in that there's a certain amount of crime or in like immoral acts maybe that have been prevented as a result of like religion being there. Like the 10 Commandments has probably in some way, shape, or form stopped a certain level of theft, murder, coveting, using the Lord's name in vain.
Do you think like the thought of hell is essentially the lion's pit?
Ooh, that'd be a good name for the episode right there. Anyway, yeah, I mean the thought of hell I think is, but I also think it serves the purpose of the story is connected to emotion, and then that emotion gets transferred to like real life situations. So like for example, I think and Keith, I think neither you and I grew up religious at all, right?
That's right.
Like, I mean, I never went to church a single time growing up, and
no,
I don't think you really
Once
did.
Or twice.
Right? Like, yeah, like I think I went to see somebody get confirmed. That was like my first time stepping foot in a church because I was like invited, So I mean, as I'm like, I realize we're kind of like, sounds like we're almost defending religion. You and I don't really have much of a stake in the game there, but I don't know. I wonder if the feeling, so like let's say that I'm mad at somebody, like at my job, right? I'm like, I hate this person, they're so annoying, they send me passive aggressive emails. I might think to myself like, oh, Jesus says you should love your enemy, right? And so like in that moment, rather than continuing to be like passive aggressive or angry toward that person, I then will be like, oh, I'm gonna like not do that, I'm gonna do what Jesus would have done. You know what I mean? So it allows like the story of Jesus allows me to apply the story to a situation in my life, maybe a way that like simply like logic couldn't do. Like I couldn't be like, it is illogical for me to be mad at this email because, I should assume positive intent because it produces the most positive emotion for me over time. Like there's not like
what do you think Sam would say?
That's what I think goes on with Sam. That thing that I just said is I think what goes on in Sam Harris's head.
that was the brain of Sam Harris speaking.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's tough because I do wonder if the edifice of religion allows people to act in a way good and maybe a way to de-stress, and a way to, like, confessional is a perfect example of that. It's like so damn therapeutic to spill your guts to somebody and tell them all the bad things you've done. Like that's so obviously an instance where religion provides something that today maybe a therapist would provide or what have you. So there's probably all these cases where religion is really healthy for people, just emotionally or spiritually or socially. But I think Sam is all about, again, that truth claim. Is it actually true? And if it's not, I think his take would be like, well, it's essentially phone. We can find other ways of doing the same things that are better and more, I guess, straightforward or honest. Like just see a therapist. You don't need to go and confess your sins.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's like the moral evolution. That's kind of like Nietzsche, right? Like God is dead. We don't really need religion to fill these roles anymore. But I mean, I guess as a therapist, I'll just say that like I don't know if people always understand the moral or logic behind what we're trying to tell them, and sometimes you have to come up with like metaphors or stories to help people like get what you're trying to sell them. So for example, Keith, I'll try to explain to somebody that depression is illogical, right? And that's basically what cognitive behavioral therapy is for somebody. Is I'll say something like, oh, you know, like if you view everything negative, you're going to get into like a negative confirmation bias cycle where you continuously see more negative things, right? But if I say that to like the average patient or client, they're just going to be like, okay, you know. But then if I say what I usually say, which is like depression is like a monster that eats negativity, right? And the more you feed it, the like stronger it becomes. Like people like the story or the visual better than they like the pure logical fact given to them, if that makes sense.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, everybody can relate to that. I wonder what that is, though, because I guess it seems like the way our brains are set up, like we, you know, maybe it's like the fact that we're a product of evolution. Like we lived in a world where we're monsters, essentially, like creatures trying to eat us. You know what I mean? Like and on some level, that's still the world we live in. It's just we don't have to worry about it anymore because we're cocooned in this, you know, titanic civilization where everything we need is basically given to us. But maybe any sort of like description like that, it appeals to something deeper. Whereas like the super rational, logical description, even though it's more truthful, doesn't have that like grittiness that our brain seems to kind of thrive on, or the descriptions that we really like to hear.
Right.
Something like that.
Right. And so I guess that's what that's what I think Sam sometimes misses or something. Yeah. And part of that I think is he's just so damn smart. I mean, I would bet that this is a man who has an IQ of like 160. You know, average IQ of a person in America is about 100. You know, so he is like, we're talking 3 or 4 standard deviations above average, which, I mean, we're talking 1% of the world population is able to, you know, I would bet if we gave Sam Harris an IQ test, he would get every single question right.
It's interesting, though, like that's a really tough thing to wrestle with, because part of me thinks, okay, you know, the smart guy wins or whatever. Like if he's the smartest and sees things most accurately, we'll kind of put him in charge essentially, or he can be like on the cutting edge because he has that kind of mind. And the other part of me thinks, well, in terms of building a community of people who live harmoniously or what have you, or giving people purpose in life, like the underneath the bell curve in the middle, the average, that's, you kind of need to pitch to that because that's where most people are at. And so if this guy is understanding life in a way that very few people can grasp, even if he's correct, I wonder if maybe he's not the best leader or the best, you know, I don't know, constructor for a system. You know what I mean?
Well, and I would contrast him with somebody like Bill Clinton, right? So Sam Harris is smart, but maybe lacks that ability to connect with others. Bill Clinton, on the other hand, is like has both. He has an IQ that's well known as like being way up there, 150, 160, was a Rhodes Scholar, you know, or a Rhodes Scholar and all that kind of stuff. But also could be like the Southern, like, I'm just a Southern gentleman who loves pecan pie, and like, you can trust me. And I, you know, sometimes I get into trouble, but, you know, overall I'm out for your best interest. Like he knew how to read like maybe somebody who's not as intelligent as him's mind, and then convey the intelligent thought to them in a way that they could hear it. Yeah.
It's funny because he's so, I mean, I don't know Sam's life. I assume he's like a fairly virtuous person. I think he's married with a couple of kids, couple of girls maybe. I just think of Bill Clinton, like clearly he enjoyed the sensuous life, you know, in terms of being like loving women, loving sex, loving chocolate, loving McDonald's, loving power, loving, you know, displaying power. Like he was like, I don't know how to articulate that. He has maybe that computer brain underneath humming along. He's very smart, but he's also just like, he's like an animal too, in a way where Sam seems more like a computer.
Yeah, I think Sam is very computer-like. And I would say probably Sam Harris is like faster than Bill Clinton in terms of being analytical. Like there's times where I listen to Sam Harris's podcast where he will say something, or one of his guests will say something, and he will break it apart and take apart and like have like a 4 or 5 like almost like PowerPoint bullet points that like are like, you need to address these 5 fallacies that you have said in your discussion, and then we can move forward. And he does it in such an instant that
Mhm.
it's astounding. You know what I mean? It really is. Like, I mean, I like to think of myself as like a pretty smart guy, and I'll catch these things. But for me to be able to immediately verbalize it back to the person in a way that is like articulate and helpful to them is like beyond me. Like I'll be able to be like, oh, that's kind of what I was thinking when Sam Harris will say his thing, but it's just so obvious that he's already like done all the internal work and organization, versus for me there's just like some messiness still going on internally with it.
Yeah. It's interesting just in terms of cognition, like the whole phenomenon of like, you don't really think, like words just sort of pop into your mind. Ideas just kind of like appear there and you speak them. Like, I imagine if you have a brain like Sam Harris, there's just these sort of like fairly highly developed maps that kind of pop up, like you just have this clear like scaffolding, like a taxonomy of whatever corrections that need to be made to some proposition that someone gave you. And as soon as you hear it, your brain goes error, 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 error 1, error 2, error 3.
Right.
And you can just spit them out. And it as if it's just like, there's no, I don't know, it comes so naturally to him. I guess it's the case with everybody. I guess it's not a very profound insight, but it just seems kind of amazing that that's his experience internally, just this very lucid critique of everyone's arguments.
Right. Well, I think that is insightful what you said, because I don't think everybody works like that. I think other people are kind of more messy. They're less computer like. It's like if an argument kind of sounds like something else, people will go tangential or jump from one thought to another, or jump to a feeling and ignore like the logic, just because it's almost like ink and water. Right? Like Sam Harris's ink and water are really separate, but with everybody else, it's like it gets blurry, when like people put a spoon to it.
Do you think essentially Sam Harris is better, or do you think there's some utility in the mixing that other people have?
I'm going to say Sam Harris is better.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, I think honestly, if people were more analytical in that way, they would probably... the world would be better. People would like be happier. We'd be more logical. We wouldn't have a lot of the problems. But yeah, I mean, the problem is that Sam Harris is a really, really well working machine that's linked up and connected to a bunch of machines that aren't as good. So he's just putting this like high pace, high quality output that has to go through like the 1997 Dell computer. You know what I mean? That everybody had when they went to college or whatever, the little it's all getting plugged into an old iPod, and so it just is limited in what other people can do. And that's like part of his frustration, I think, all the time, is he's constantly trying to like fix these errors that, don't necessarily want to be fixed, or that don't have the capacity to be fixed in other people. And I think religion is kind of the manifestation of that.
Yeah, although if everyone was like Sam Harris, it seems like in some ways it would be a more boring world, and maybe this is like, I don't know, just there's a certain drama in life, and the fact that there's a bunch of idiots and people who are crazy and people who have very artistic brains, like maybe incredibly talented, but are not articulate. I see this with artists a lot, actually. I think good artists are kind of on the cutting edge in some weird sensuous way, where they create things that are fascinating and compelling, and they feel like this kind of instinct. They just barf up something beautiful, and they have no idea like what it's about. And if you ask them to say, well, what's the meaning or the deeper like significance of this piece of art, they have no idea. And it takes maybe someone else to come and actually kind of say, well, this creation in the 1950s, while the Cold War was starting up and people were concerned about nuclear Armageddon, and you can see these deep-seated worries in this piece of art, and they sort of analyze it in a greater sociological context. But the artist himself isn't really thinking in those sort of terms. That's not a Sam Harris brain. That's a different type of human. But I think there's still some, utility, something valuable about that as well.
Okay, well, let me ask you this. This is where it gets really tricky-wicky. Right? If Sam Harris, let's just say, was really into art, would he be a better artist than most people? Like if he was formally trained, you know what I mean, had learned the theory of art, the history of art.
Yeah. I don't even know how to answer that. I would imagine he would be kind of perfectionist, and he may be very highly skilled in a very particular way, but I don't think his brain would let him create certain kinds of aesthetics that I guess are messier or more intuitive. I think of him as almost like a rule follower in a way, a really superb rule follower.
Well, I think not maybe not rules, but like principled.
Yeah,
And,
yeah,
and you're saying in art, there's certain principles that there's like value in violating them.
yeah. The goal in some ways is sometimes is breaking the rules. You have to learn the rules first in order to break them with any kind of skill. But people do, yeah, combine categories and do things that are strange, and then that's like a little breakthrough.
Because I guess there's this, it kind of connects to, there's this deeper argument that's gone on for a long time, and it's kind of settled, but I mean, people still go on and on about it. And I think Sam Harris had one guy talk about intelligence on his podcast. I can't remember the whole thing, but there's kind of like two theories of intelligence. There's like one intelligence called the G factor, which is like an IQ. Like, there's an IQ score, and people who have high IQs can do most things, right? And then there's like the multiple intelligences, which you and I are talking about. Like, there's somebody who's artistic and they're like good at that, and then there's somebody who's like a mechanic and they tend to be good at that, and then there's somebody who's like really good at interpersonally, and they tend to be like, they have like what we call intrapersonal intelligence, right? But they might be terrible at like doing an IQ test. And what research has indicated is that the multiple intelligence tend to not exist. Is that
Really?
is that there actually is like one G factor? They call it, I don't know why they call it. I think it's like a general intelligence. That's why they call it a G factor. There tends to be one intelligence, and if you take that person, chances are they would be good at almost anything they did. So they would be the best musician, they would be the best artist, they would also be the best at math. But it's just like where they put their energy. I'm not saying
that wrecks my theory that he would still be in this model. He would still be a tremendously talented artist or musician or whatever. Yeah, maybe that's right. I don't know. What do you think?
I think that another piece of intelligence is work ethic. And I think that's where Sam Harris, I think, also thrives. Is he's the kind of guy who can write, like, he's written, like, how many books now? 15 books or something like that. He makes these podcasts every week. He does these appearances. He made it through a PhD program while writing books. So, he's also very prolific. And I think there's things you learn and you become more intelligent as you're working, on things. So my guess is that if he was an artist, he might, like, at the beginning struggle with some of the things you said, but then, like, as he evolved, he would get better faster than other people. Or I think a better maybe analogy is if he was playing guitar, he might not have that, like, natural thing that Jimi Hendrix or like John Mayer has. But over time he would, like, evolve more quickly than other people and be able to get to that John Mayer, Jimi Hendrix level. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. You don't know.
It's a heavy idea because you want to think that, like, everyone has something special and unique about them, and the idea that no, either you have it or you don't. Like, you either have this intelligence or not, and if you don't, you're screwed because there's nothing you can do about it. That's a really tough pill to swallow. It's probably true, but it's not something people want to believe.
Well, and the really sad thing is not even, I think that's sad. I think even sadder, though, is the amount of people who had that IQ and then never had it developed.
That's, man, it's such a tough thing. It's what I struggle with, too, is just discipline and actually doing work. You know what I mean? I feel like I've got intelligence and talent, but I feel like it's a constant battle to actually sit down and write, read, and actually, like, be productive. That's another skill in and of itself.
Yeah, but part of that, too, is, at least in academia, there's, like, there's so much bureaucracy. You know what I mean? Like, you and I right now are having, like, a pretty intelligent conversation, and we can just throw it up on the internet in like 5 seconds, and that's, like, really fun and valuable and interesting and something you want to do. But if we have to go through, like, the peer review process and actually sit down and, like, write it in a format that's, like, acceptable in academia, that like kind of kills the fun of it. And so that's what I think. That's what I personally think makes me, like, less productive as an academic, is that there's, like, such process and boredom that's attached to, like, actually getting the idea out there. It's like if you were trying to a painting, or you're trying to make a movie, and then like 57, you know that before you're allowed to release it for people to see, 57 other people have to touch it and edit it and add something to it and take something away. And somebody gets to take like a scissors and scrape it up, and you have to like fix it. You know, it's kind of like, well, why would I want to paint anything? You know, like what's the point? You know? Yeah,
it's funny how oftentimes really potent and powerful art is one person's vision. You know, like it comes maybe obviously comes from a certain culture, and in that sense, lots of people have their handprints on it. But like it's basically Picasso with a paintbrush making his thing, or Mozart or whatever. There's very few really powerful artistic creations that are done by committee. I think Christopher Hitchens used to say the King James Bible is like the one example. And sometimes movies, like obviously it takes many, hundreds of people to create a movie, and sometimes it's still breathtaking. But I think often even then it's like maybe the director was incredibly dominant and like made sure it was his or her vision that, saw itself into the picture, like The Godfather or something like that.
Yep, and that's just to bring it to another example. That's exactly how Bruce Springsteen runs the E Street Band. He used to do things like when he first got started, like in a more democratic way, where he'd be like, "Oh, what do you want to do in this song?" Or "What do you think we should do?" And then he just learned that like that's terrible, and that's why they call him the boss.
Is that really where that started from?
Yeah. It was like he just said like, "No, this is not a democracy. This is a dictatorship, and I am the boss, and I write the songs, and I make all the decisions, and I decide when we go on tour." And he literally says in his biography, that is the single thing that has allowed the E Street Band to continue for like 30 or 40 years. Because like he's like, all the problems fall on me, but all the decisions also fall on me. So anyway.
Yeah, that's fantastic. That's really interesting to hear. That's I can see that all over the place where there's great power. I mean, it reminds me of like the idea of a fascist state where it's like, well, at least the trains run on time. And it's like there's a downside to that, especially at like a high level, because one person or a tiny group has absolute power, and power corrupts, and so you're asking for trouble. But there is a flip side where one individual has tremendous power, where you can make shit happen. You can whole machinery around you work like a unity, as opposed to having to deal with conflict everywhere.
So I just thought,
did I just compare Springsteen to a fascist state?
No. That wasn't what was making me laugh. That's awesome too. But what would a Sam Harris nation look like? Like mandatory 2-hour meditations every day for everybody. Like everybody has to read like new atheism books on a daily basis. Like you must rid yourself of religion.
He was talking about Islamic country. I forget the scenario now, but like the bell. Is it a bell? Like a noise that rings when everyone knows it's time to pray. Now you pray 5 times a day, and so there's this, horn or what have you. Everyone in the city stops what they're doing and prays. And Sam was saying he sees that as maybe tyrannical because it's in religion, but a community where there's some kind of call to meditate multiple times a day so that everybody is basically like on the same wavelength, he would really love. And I thought that was really fascinating. I totally understand why he would feel that way. And yet it is a little, I don't know what I think about that. It's a little funny because here is an instance of people existing in that kind of deep spiritual way, but he rejects that deeply when it's Islamic.
So what I picture in my head is everybody wearing like robes, and everybody has that same like crew cut haircut that Sam Harris has, and everybody's meditating, and then like a drunken Ben Affleck is like running through the streets like, this is all bullshit.
In a suit.
Yeah, in a suit.
With his hair slicked back.
What do you stop this? And they're like, shut up, Ben Affleck.
Now I picture it getting darker then, and then they chain him up and they take him into the Coliseum, and it's Ben Affleck and like a lion fighting to the death while a stadium full of Sam Harris lookalikes just watch silently and smile. They just smirk a little bit.
Yeah, exactly.
It has that eyebrow raised that Sam does at one thing where he's like, I can't believe you're saying this.
Yeah, that's the Sam Harris Republic.
God, that would be. I don't know if I want to live in the Sam Harris Republic. There's something. I don't know. Maybe I'm just not deep enough.
I mean, I think
spiritual enough.
I think I would in a way, because I think it would eliminate a lot of like the really like problems that are based on really stupid things. You know what I mean? Like like inequality and greed, and like everything is profit incentivized. You know what I mean? I just feel like Sam Harris would probably not be like super in favor of that, especially when it doesn't make sense. So I've always been a little bit of a fan of the whole like Plato philosopher king thing, you know, where you should have leaders or people running the country who are like smarter and more expert, or more of experts on things.
Sure.
Like
sure.
like everybody in the EPA, for my example, I think we should make it so the government is like the pinnacle achievement of like academia. You know, so like the person who's the best geologist and the best environmental scientist and the best environmental engineer should be the ones who run the EPA.
I mean, it's so easy to say that. Like, I could easily agree with that, but also it's different. There was a case of a fantastic academic. I totally forget who this was now, but he talked a lot about politics and like the system is corrupt. And he actually ran for, I think it was some at the state level, and was elected. And he ended up leaving politics after 2 years because he couldn't hack it. And basically, what he realized was the way decisions are actually made in these, smoke-filled back rooms where you get somebody to agree to do something for you, but you make a promise to someone else and you exchange promises. There's like a real, not nastiness, but maybe nastiness to actually making the machinery move and getting things done. And this guy was very smart and was just not, he couldn't slap people on the back and, make friends with the people he had to make friends with. He just wasn't that kind of human, and he couldn't do the job. So I think in reality, the people who rise to that level, who are the best geologists or the best whatever, or end up in charge of these giant structures, have a different kind of skill set. You know what I mean? Than the academic.
But that's because the system is like corrupt in the way it is. It's like, even if you introduce,
what does that mean?
Well, I guess like if you introduce like a pure element into a corrosive environment and then expect the pure element to clean the entire corrosive environment, it can't.
No, I think like to call it a corrosive environment is like overly simplistic. Like that is just a group of human beings being human creates a corrosive environment.
But I'm saying if there was more academic-y people, maybe not academics, just people who have like proven themselves in some way, in that environment, you'd be less likely to have the smoke-filled back rooms where people are like slapping each other on the back.
I don't know if I agree. You might be right, but I guess proving yourself makes it easier. Like, okay, I guess these are people who have merit or
right. But what you're saying to me that the politicians are, and tell me if this is correct or not, or if I'm way off, or this is just like the whole I'm seeing, is that these politicians, like they're just average. They represent average people, but these scientists are unique. But I would say the type of person who becomes a politician is the type of person who does like the backroom, like dealings and like slapping each other in the back, and they view everything as like deal making and negotiation, because they're the type of person who thinks that they deserve to be a congressperson. Like, so that's just a different type of person. Like, I think if everybody in the government was like an academic, the government would start to reflect academia. I think right now the reason Congress reflects Congress, or Congress is what it is because it's full of like a bunch of like narcissists who are like very self-interested,
I guess what I'm saying, I hear you, but what I'm saying is if you could like have the hand of God and change it around, it would be really effective for a year or two. But I think what like naturally would occur on a long enough timeline is it would become corrupt again. It would be those maybe narcissistic people who want to be powerful, would like a magnet attracts. Those people would end up in those positions again, and the more maybe like decent people would get shoved out. You know what I mean? So I think like that's just what happens essentially.
But don't you think the proving ground that you have to make to become a top academic in your field is a lot steeper and a better like test than it would be just to get elected to something? Like, for example, I'll give you an example, right? So John Kasich, right, the guy who is like the governor of Ohio, he he kind of got ahead because he went from the world of like being a state representative, which he probably just got from being a good guy or whatever, to working at like Goldman Sachs. So it was like his ability to like sell out and like totally like give in to like the big banking system eventually led to him being the governor of Ohio. You know, versus like if you're going through academia, like, or you're having to become like a top mind in your field, you actually have to like prove things, and you have to have like good theories and a good scientific mind. Like the BS, or your ability to like, if you sell out or do something the easy way, those types of people get eliminated really early on.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with that. It's just that it sounds like it's a kind of like pie in the sky, like, wouldn't it be nice if things were nicer kind of statement.
Yeah, that's probably true.
You know what I mean? So yeah, that's fine. Yeah, it would be nice if things were nicer.
And I do like pie. Pie is delicious.
We hit on quite a few things, but we had a list. I think what were a couple of the other big ones from Sam Harris who wanted to...
So we got meditation, which we started talking about in the Sam Harris Republic. So Sam Harris's view on meditation, because you did the first one, you did religion, so I'll talk about a little bit of his views on meditation, is that meditation is, for one, it's a good replacement for spirituality. That it provides that same spiritual connection or internal, I don't know what you want to call it, energy that people like want to manage. And so he does it through meditation, and he has taken it to a pretty extreme place. So he's written books, which, Keith, I think you've read some of the books. I have not. I've only listened to his podcast. But, you know, he'll go and do like months and months of a silent retreat, or he will, he says he meditates like every day for like an hour or two, I think, on the podcast, which is pretty impressive when you think about it. And he specifically talks a lot about your ability to control emotion and to mitigate some of the anxiety and stress you feel through meditation. So the example he gives on the podcast quite often is, you know, if you're a person who gets angry or frustrated at work, if you meditate every day, you learn to control that anger and frustration, and it goes from being, you know, you're angry for a half hour every day or for an hour to you're angry for like 15 seconds. And so he has claimed a pretty big mastery of emotion and anxiety through meditation. And I would say there's a considerable amount of research in psychology that would back that up. But, you know, I haven't read his books on meditation, Keith, so maybe you can add something.
No, I mean, I think that's all accurate. I think he's basically feels like, well, he had a few experiences. I know he took MDMA as a 19-year-old or so, and had like a profound experience with his friend, where he just felt this like overwhelming sense of love and admiration for his buddy, and had the experience. I guess he was made aware of all the little internal maneuverings that you undergo when you speak with somebody. Like, you censor yourself, you say something that isn't true because you want them to like you, and all that was like gone. And it was just like this sense of pure love or what have you. And it was somewhat reminiscent of I don't know, like a story of Jesus, or like some deep some old biblical tale of someone who radiated total love, or these profound experiences. And anyways, long story short, he appreciated consciousness was a lot more than what he experienced on a day-to-day level. And I think he took LSD maybe a few times, and got really deep into exploring consciousness. Eventually led him to meditation and to these really intensive retreats where you don't talk to anybody essentially for 10 days or even for months. You barely speak with people. And I think that's and his interest in neurology comes ultimately from these early experiences of exploring consciousness. And
with that also, and maybe this is a combination of the meditation, religion, and consciousness discussion, is he doesn't believe in any type of free will. Like, he believes in like a total deterministic worldview, which again is very analogous to his views on religion. It's this kind of like reductionistic, if you break everything down to its parts, this is all you are. You know, which, I mean, you can't, it's hard to argue with that, because that's how science is set up, you know?
What do you think about that? I struggle with that a lot. Like, the idea of no free will. Like, it just seems to me, and I guess it has to be maybe has to be technically true, but in any kind of practical way, in terms of giving advice for like how to live and how to kind of think, it just seems like obviously free will is like paramount.
Mm-hmm.
Am I wrong about that?
I think that it's really complex. I don't know if I have the answer to whether or not we have free will, but here's some like thoughts that I've thought of when I've listened to Sam Harris's book on Audible, or I have had this discussion with people who are interested in Sam Harris, because I did read his book on free will. Is that one thing? So he just says, like, basically my neurochemistry is conditioned and based on my past experiences. Right. So if I have had really positive experiences with, like you, Keith, when I see you, a certain level of dopamine rushes, and then that's conditioned, and then I behave in a way that is accordance with that. So you have this interplay between like behavior, environment, and your neurochemistry, and that there's no kind of rider. There's no like ego kind of involved in that process. But I think that the problem is like it's a lot messier than that, and it doesn't explain all the variance in free will, because there's like an unfalsifiable piece to that. Like, so Keith, if I'm having like a bad day and I see you, and then like I'm not as happy to see you because I've got this other stuff going on, it's not as simple as like, oh, the interaction with my work and me having a bad day doesn't blend into my interaction with you. Right? And so there's this messiness that Sam doesn't necessarily address. And then the other piece of it is like, if we are just a product of our dopamine and and serotonin and everything rushing, it doesn't always explain the movement or how much dopamine or serotonin rushes at any given moment, or why it goes in the directions that it does. So I don't know if that makes sense, what I kind of just said.
It does make sense. I mean, what I take away from it is, on this micro level, there's like machinery at work essentially, and the machinery pushes you one way or the other without you realizing it. And so more or less there's a kind of automation that occurs that most people aren't thinking about or aren't aware of. And then I guess hundreds of years ago, we simply wouldn't have known about. We didn't have the tools to grasp that kind of thing. So it makes a certain amount of sense why people would have assumed free will, and why maybe now it seems a bit dubious. But what trips me up is thinking, like, even in a conversation about free will, like, I guess, like, if I assert that free will doesn't exist, or that it does exist, that like, even those words coming out of my mouth, that should be a part of the lack of free will or what have you. Like, it just seems like there's a weird, it's not a paradox, but it just seems a little bit frustrating to me that like somebody could say kind of in a cocky way, like, no, free will doesn't exist. And as they're speaking those words, I suppose that's supposed to be subsumed under, a mechanical operation or whatever. I don't know if I'm saying that very well, but it just seems like my experience of life is very much that I have decisions to make, and there's like, the little angel and the little devil on either shoulder is like a good cartoon metaphor for the way people experience things. And sometimes you kind of can summon the willpower to choose one or the other. And in situations where, people who are like, who are depressed, and there's this guy who ran like 200 miles or 150 miles over 3 days, or one of these insane races in the desert. This guy was like very overweight and unhealthy and like hated himself, and one day was like, fuck this, like, I'm just gonna run constantly from now here on out and like lift weights and eat healthy. I'm gonna do anything and everything I have to do to change myself. Like, you just hear about these occurrences where people, or maybe someone who like protests the war in Vietnam and sets himself on fire, or is willing to die for a cause that's very abstract. Like, all these situations where human beings apparently choose to do things which, and from any kind of evolutionary point of view, don't make a whole lot of sense, because they die or what have you. It just doesn't seem like this deterministic worldview does much for describing all of that stuff.
Well, and if you really want to get nuts with it, you got to even go, you can even connect it to, I think C.S. Lewis talks about this, but it's a similar thing to what Neil deGrasse Tyson talks about, is it's like, if we're all just star stuff, like our decision to do this podcast right now, Keith, was made, when when the Big Bang happened. Like, we are just a product of those atoms that have continued to move and function, and like there's no decision making. Like the universe is just continuously unraveling, right? And we're just like a ripple in that unraveling, right? So everything in your life is just a function of those atoms and where they're heading and where they're moving at any given point, and we're just like a little stopping point on the maze of where they're heading. And so it goes even far. I think C.S. Lewis's example is like, he talks about like, when I drop the milk, in the middle of the night, like it's hard for me to accept that like a hydrogen atom determined that, or something like that, like from thousands of years ago. I can't remember the exact analogy, but it's something like that. So yeah.
Do you ever get tripped out when I hear you talk that way and I think about it, like even right now, like recording the podcast, looking at the screen and stuff, like I do feel a little like tripped out, or like I kind of like, it's not like an out of body experience, but I feel a bit disassociated or something, and I don't like it, because it's like, oh no, I got to keep my shit together and pay attention to what's being said and stuff.
Right. Well, I mean, that would be Sam Harris's like probably argument for why you want to hang on to free will. Right, it's because like the lack of free will sends you into this tailspin internally that you are just this like little robot, and you don't want to accept that lack of control. There's a psychologist named B.F. Skinner who wrote a book called Beyond Freedom and Dignity, which is like essentially on that subject. That if you need to let go of the idea that you have any type of free will, and we should start engineering society in a way that conditions people to do things. And shouldn't be focused on like for example, jailing people because they're criminals makes no sense from that perspective. We should just do whatever rehabilitates people who are in those situations, and we should like test it and scientifically, figure out and do control groups and eventually figure out the exact process of, rehabilitation. It doesn't like putting just like locking a person away doesn't make any sense, because it's not their fault they're a criminal. And even in extreme cases like child molesters or murderers or whatever, or terrorists or whatever, like they are just a product of their environment plus their neurochemistry. So it doesn't make any sense to like to punish them in any moral way.
Isn't there some kind of weirdness there with him? Like him even bothering to focus on that and like make that pronouncement, doesn't it kind of suggest that he exists in a little bubble of free will and he can sit and think about this stuff?
Well, that connects to my deeper belief that Sam Harris thinks he's the only one who has free will. Right.
Let's talk about that.
Yeah, he's actually like
break that one out.
That's like the ultimate form of narcissism, right? I don't think Sam Harris is narcissistic very much or anything like that. But and partially because his hatred of Trump is so anti-narcissistic. But yeah, I do think a little bit. I don't know. There is something to that. I've thought that same thing. I'm like, even you writing this book is on free, is kind of an act of free will. Yeah. But it's the same thing with faith, though. I mean, it's very analogous. Like, if you purely look at it from a scientific kind of logical reductionistic perspective, it's hard to argue that we're not just our neurochemistry. But the thing that keeps people hanging on to it is like your internal experience of your body, of your life, of your choices. When I'm thinking about the multiple things I could say to you at any given moment, Keith, I feel like I'm making a choice. But when they've done studies on it, they have found that they can predict people's choices before the people are even aware of them.
I've heard that, but isn't that too like, I don't know. So it's like 1 second or like a split second before they make the choice.
You're right. So what they'll do is they'll put people in an MRI machine and they'll have them choose like 1 out of 3 things or 1 out of 2 things or whatever. And they can predict what the person's going to choose even before like the choice is presented.
Before the choice is presented? What do you mean?
So let's say I have you pick green, red, or blue, Keith. Right, and so we know we're gonna present this green, red, or blue choice to you, but I don't know yet. Right, and you don't know yet. But by us monitoring your brain chemistry, we can say when we present this choice to him, he's gonna pick green.
And they're right, not all the time.
Most of the time, I think pretty much yes.
And that's based on what?
Like they're watching what's going on in your brain around like decision making up to that moment.
and they can somehow distinguish between blue, green, whatever that brain, like whatever brain activity is associated with those colors or something like that.
Yeah. And so you think for a second, you think in your head like, oh, I'm going to pick green because like green's kind of nice right now. But it's not. Like that's just your interpretation of the neurochemistry going on under the surface.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's fascinating.
It's almost like you rationalize the choice after it's made for you.
Mm-hmm. I guess I immediately bring us into the question of like what makes a good life and what kind of ethic do you need to sort of to feel like you are, I guess, somewhat heroic and enthusiastic about getting on with things. Mm-hmm. And it just seems like the deterministic worldview. It's like, well, why, you wake up in the morning in your bed and it's like, well, why bother getting out of bed? It seems like it undermines your whole life. Like it undermines when there's a pathway in front of you and you're like, can I take the easy way or the hard way or what should I do or say? Like, it just seems like, it pulls the rug out from under you on everything. So then it's like, well, how do you why get out of bed in the morning or why try to do difficult things or, you know what I mean? I guess that isn't clear to me. I mean, obviously Harris is somebody who's super driven, so he must have a very clear understanding of how you can be enthusiastic about life even though you feel like you're kind of automated or something.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with you, Keith, that it kills the humanity, which is why I think Sam Harris would argue that's why people are resistant to it. But regardless of how we feel about it, that's the way it is. Not Kipp's argument. Just that's, that would be the deterministic argument.
It's weird that evolution has produced creatures that, when they investigate themselves, feel this dissonance between like you don't want to accept the truth. Like why would that be? It seems like very bizarre that would be offensive to us if it's our true nature. Okay,
well, like for example, I can't see all the germs on my hand right now, but we know that there's like there they are. we know that there's like hundreds of thousands of them there, right?
Yeah.
So it's hard for me to think that like washing my hands could prevent me from like dying or could prevent me from getting sick because my experience is I look at my hands and they're clean, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if maybe there's flu virus like all over it right now.
Yeah.
So it's the same kind of thing, but like eventually we've gotten to the point where we've been able to transcend that, where I truly believe that like if I wash my hands, it's going to be a preventative factor from getting sick. Even though my lived experience is so incongruent with that. It's almost like a faith thing in itself, right? I have faith that there's these secret little bugs all over my hand, even though I can't see them. The difference is I can prove or somebody can prove to me that they're there, unlike religion, So, all right, Keith, I think we got to move on though, because we're hitting that 1 hour mark, and I think we got to.
Are we?
Yeah, we got to keep on kicking it here. So let's talk about lying really quick. Now, Keith, you haven't read his book on lying, correct?
No.
Okay, so essentially what Sam Harris makes the argument for, and this is the reason we're talking about this is not because I think this is like I think it's interesting, but it more represents Sam's logic or the depth at which he is committed to logic, where I think a lot of other people will abandon logic for comfort. It's very like Socrates-esque, like Socrates, even though he doesn't have to die, will drink the hemlock because it's like democracy has decided this and I have to follow my principles like all the way to the end. It's the same thing here where Sam Harris essentially argues that there is never a moment where you should lie. That lying ultimately doesn't work out. Even in like the most small or tiny little white lie scenarios ultimately lead to bigger problems. So the example he gives that he says most people have trouble with is like, let's say, Keith, that I were to buy you a present, and let's say I were to buy you a football, right? And Keith is not a person who enjoys football by any stretch of the imagination, even though he lives in Philadelphia and they're going to the Super Bowl.
I'm going to pretend I got to fake it if I don't want to get my ass kicked on Sunday.
So, exactly. So, let's say I buy you the football. Now, what would you do when I'm like, hey, Keith, I got you this? And it's like, let's say it's a Philadelphia Eagles football, So, it's clear I put some thought into it, but maybe it was like...
Oh, geez, Kipp, thank you.
Yeah.
I've always wanted a football.
Yeah, so this is great. But internally, maybe it'd be like, oh, well, this is okay. Or, Kipp's, I appreciate the thought. Right, or I appreciate the thought or whatever. So Sam Harris is like, that. Even in that situation, you shouldn't lie. Because what it does...
Is that really what he says?
Yeah, he does. He gives that exact example minus the football, just like buying a gift. Because his belief is that it like creates a rupture in the relationship that leads to more lying. So for example, like I will feel like, oh yeah, like I did something really nice for Keith. Like Keith and me are tight right now. And then on the other hand, you're kind of like, well, he doesn't even know me. Like, so it ends up like I end up going in one direction and you end up going in another direction based on that lie. And so then that creates more problems as like the world goes on between us versus like that initial, like you being like, oh, you know, I appreciate the thought, but I really don't like football. Like, even though there's like a brutalness to that, ultimately, like we stay on the same page and then our relationship is like repairable. So,
I mean, that makes sense, but it seems like you could also say like, well, by telling the little lie, you are extending like a certain amount of love to the other person. Like you're trying to protect their feelings. And in some cases, maybe that does horrible damage if it's something like not the football example, but it seems like on a football example, it's not necessarily going to open up into some huge difference or some, you know, horrible being on two different pages in the future.
I would agree with you. But Sam Harris is committed to it. And so he says, you know, anytime you lie or even things like, you know, hey, I'm going to be late. So because of this, like rather than telling people like why you're late, like I think that's a really good example, like, you know, especially in academia where people lie all the time. I don't know if you've experienced this, Keith, but people will show up late for things. They will not turn in things. They'll say I had too much going on, but they just like fell asleep. You know, there's all this like people hide. I like to think of it as like people like to hide in the tornado of busyness that is academia, you know? So he would say like what that does is that it creates all these negative impressions around like your value system. So, you know, you or I, like I might be like working with you on a project and you're like not really into it, but like you don't want me to think that. So then you keep working and then it ultimately like wastes my time, you know?
It's interesting. Jordan Peterson often says you need to tell the truth, like speak your truth. That's the big thing. Speak your truth. You might be misinformed, and then if so, you get corrected. And that's how you get corrected if you say something true. Whereas if you say something that you think will please somebody, but it's phony, it doesn't really matter because you're not ever going to get corrected. You can't really get to the root. But I think he also will say that white lies are okay because they're true at a different level of resolution. So you say something that technically is untrue, but what you mean, you know, the reason you tell that lie is to keep the relationship intact or what have you.
Right.
That's interesting. I feel like it's often the case of these big thinkers, like they have really profound disagreements, but somehow they still kind of like end up saying a lot. They give very similar advice or the same advice, like on something like that. Always try to tell the truth. Remember that movie, Office Space?
Yeah.
The guy gets hypnotized.
Yeah.
And then he never gets unhypnotized. Yeah. So he goes to work and effectively he stops lying. Like, you know, he just says to his boss, like, oh yeah, you know, I overslept. Sorry, I didn't feel like coming in on time. Like he just totally is honest. But then instead of his life falling apart, somehow it leads to like bliss, you know, things go his way, comically go his way.
Yeah. Well, and I would say the flip side to that is Liar, Liar with Jim Carrey, where it like shows like the real problems that occur when you lie, when you don't lie, and how many people's feelings get hurt and how much of like a struggle it is. So, yeah, I mean, I think there's merit to it. I like the idea like the big thinkers end up in the same spots. Because I think that that's definitely true in my field in psychology. A lot of the big like thinkers, even though they call things different, they call variables different things. They ultimately like came to the same conclusions around like what makes people feel better. And so yeah, I would agree with that people end up at the same spot. And I think the funny thing about it is it almost ends up being like a simple truth. Like don't lie.
Yeah.
I mean that's one of the commandments.
I know
isn't
it's
it?
weird. I know. But I guess it shouldn't be that big of a surprise, I guess. You know, if intelligent people back in the day were thinking about this stuff as well, like they would have approached it differently, but it would follow that they would come to some basic tenets that would be true for people, you know, during whatever century you might live in. Right.
Okay, so let's move on from the lying debate and let's get on to the last subject, which is like Sam Harris's utter hatred and complete grotesqueness. Is that a word? Like his just absolute the volatility he feels toward Donald Trump. And it's almost like, Keith, I don't know how you feel when he talks about Trump, I like get giddy inside. It's like watching a master, it's like watching a master kung fu artist or something, like take apart somebody, who's like a bully.
Yeah.
Right. And so there's times where I'm like, it's weird. It's on his podcast. He'll always say like, oh, people are so sick of me talking about Trump. And I'm like, no, dude, like keep talking about it. Like, I love this. This is like so awesome and helpful for me.
It's like catnip for you.
It really is. I don't know how you feel about when he talks about Trump, but I love it. There's this one little clip where he like does an impression of Trump. And it's my favorite thing. It's Sam Harris doing an impression of Trump if Trump was Sam Harris.
Really?
Yeah, so it's how Trump would talk about Islam. So he says something along the lines of like nobody likes religion more than me. I love religion. I see value in it. I just think that it could use some tweaks. Everybody thinks this. This isn't a weird thing to think. And there's mosques. Yeah. I mean, everybody likes them. I mean, mosques are beautiful. I'm from New York. Like, some of the most beautiful mosques in the world. But that doesn't mean bad people don't exist. I mean, there's good people. And he just goes on. It's like, it's so funny. And like
that's funny. Totally, like, disjointed.
Mm-hmm. Like, so he does it almost perfect. And I wish I could, anyway, I really like that. But the thing I think is interesting about it is Trump is, in my view, in a lot of ways, the polar opposite of Sam Harris.
Yeah, yeah.
You kind of like the thing you said about Bill Clinton having an animal. Like, Trump is just the animal without the intellect. And so it's like Trump's thinking is just completely off the cuff and emotion based and like not connected to fact. And he doesn't feel any need to connect the facts to what he's saying, because it's all about just like how the other person feels like when he says it.
Yeah, it's about power. I think Trump he exists in in a world of power. So any relationship he's in, it's like, I need to be dominant, alpha male, and that's just how he experiences life, And there's a lot of strength to that. Like you can get a lot when you're always jockeying for a higher position. Obviously, in Trump's case, he hit the jackpot. It's like sort of incredible. The downside is you're like a very simplistic person too. There's another part of life that isn't always obsessed with status. And like maybe Bill Clinton is an example of somebody with both. Trump just seems to have that, caveman sensibility. But the thing is, people love that too, because it is like raw power. And there's something like you sort of know, like, I don't know, like so you picture some microcosm in high school where there's like the bully and then like, the nice kid who's maybe correct about something. But it kind of doesn't matter because like the bully is the bully and can, knock the nice kid down or whatever. Like power can trump truth in human affairs, and so people, especially if they're afraid, they will line up behind the powerful. They'll line up behind tyranny if tyranny's on their side. And I think like that's part of the appeal of like that big, it's in our DNA, like there's something appealing about having that like man up top who's willing to stomp on anyone and, everyone to maintain their position. And so I think his speech is a part of that because it's like fractured and broken up. It's just, it serves power. His speech serves power. Whatever, he'll say whatever works for him in the moment if it's going to like justify what he's doing. You know what I mean? There's no overarching coherence to his worldview.
Right. I guess I think I don't connect it as much to like people have this deep-seated desire to have like a daddy, like a father figure or something, like this powerful man. I think it's more that people really like the Fox News watchers like that Trump is entertaining and says things that are like racist. They view it as like he says things other people won't say.
Yeah.
And like that violation like brings politics back down to like the average Joe's level. Like, even if, for example, LGBT rights, like are something that like, there's a lot of thought behind it. There's research behind it. There's like rationale behind it. People have thought about it from a moral standpoint. But like ultimately a lot of, kind of like hillbilly rednecky people just think it's kind of gross. Right. So they don't want to put all the so when Trump's just like, do other people think this is weird? I just think it's kind of strange. What do you think? Right. Like people like that it speaks to this very like simplistic angry level that people have.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's more that than, or same thing with like, hey, you know when you go to the mall and you see like immigrants and like that's not what it was like when you were a kid? Doesn't that bother you,
You know
a
what,
little
though?
bit?
When you say that, though, there's a part of me that thinks, oh, that's right, and there's something good about that, actually. Not that, because I think the goal is to have an honest conversation, and sometimes that means like saying things that are inappropriate or unhelpful, and like the way to progress and to have some resolution is to actually, back to our idea of not lying, is to actually be honest. So I wonder if, like, in some weird way, like that's a kind of necessity to progress, is to have some of that come out.
Mm-hmm. I think that that's true if the honesty is connected to reality, which it often isn't. You know, it's especially if you're like a very detached, like fat millionaire. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So you're like even more disconnected. You know, and then that's what I think is the struggle. I think that could be true, and I actually think that there was times where Obama would like speak some truth about things that even when liberals didn't like it. But I think Trump doesn't. What he's saying isn't grounded in reality a lot of the times.
Mm-hmm.
It's grounded in an emotional reality for people who are like maybe uneducated or racist, but it's not connected to like any type of objective reality.
Yeah. And you think there's any utility in that emotional reality being voiced, or is that just dangerous?
I think there is. I just don't think we should set policy to it.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? So we shouldn't have like a Muslim ban. You know what I mean? Because that's like, it's not serving any type of like the people who are committing like acts aren't going through like the usual immigration process and all that. You know what I mean? It's
Sure.
so that's what I'm saying is, so when we start, it becomes, even though it might be cathartic, it's ultimately dangerous. You know, and then we end up with somebody who's like incompetent, who's only speaking to that level.
I guess what is like, is there danger in the other way too? Like in the absence of catharsis, if there's like some kind of under tension building, you know what I mean? Like if there is this, there's always going to be some kind of spectrum between like folks who are, as I see it, more enlightened and thoughtful, and people who are more backward. I mean, even if you cut a chunk off the edge, well, then you just readjust to the new whole. Like there's always some kind of spectrum.
Yeah.
And it seems to me within reason. I mean, obviously you don't want like, just insane people like in positions of power, but there's got to be a kind of pendulum swing back and forth. And if it is the case that there's this kind of pent up tension, and maybe there's like racism involved, or maybe it's more complicated than that in terms of just the economy changing and people who feel like economically frustrated. If some kind of tension needs to be released, I guess what's the most constructive way for it to be released? And I guess like following a democrat, engaging in democracy and electing somebody at the ballot and then kicking them out in 4 years seems like a fairly constructive way to do it.
Right.
You know what I mean?
I just think that the like kind of unconscious tension that sits with the society, like I think a lot of people preach that perspective, but I think that ignores how fickle like the population is and how quickly. So for example, Keith, like, 20 or even 15 years ago, like I don't think my mom or dad would even have been anywhere near the train of like gay rights should exist, or even like that gay marriage should be a thing, but if you ask my mom like today, she'd be like, oh sure, right? Because like there's just been this like slow change in the culture that's happened over time, and that's what I mean. Like I don't think that there's like this thing that has to get released societally, in order for us to progress or move forward. I think it has more to do with the fact that people will look for a scapegoat when they're economically frustrated. Like I think if especially in those poor red states, if things were going great, we probably wouldn't have seen Trump get elected. Like we wouldn't have seen, there would be less racism, people would be less prejudiced. But the fact that like states like Mississippi and Alabama are just like full of poverty, right, is like what leads people to like continue to want to focus on that like deep emotional like release, because they're looking for like a scapegoat in the same way Germany was looking for a scapegoat and elected Hitler. It's not that like Germany had people have talked about like that they've had this, Germany had this like pent up aggression from like losing World War I, which is why I just think that's like kind of like a weird, unfalsifiable way of looking at like a collective unconscious in the country versus, you know, people were just like poor, you know, and there was no money and there was all these sanctions on Germany. So they elected somebody who was like, I can get rid of all those, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't know if I see the difference there though. Like, you don't think there was a pent up in Germany? You don't think there was a pent up aggression or something? Or, I think people just felt hopeless.
I think that if Germany had invented the car at that exact moment and their industry started booming, they would have probably just been fine.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like they wouldn't have needed a release for the like they would have been like, oh, whatever that happened. Okay, now we've got.
There would have been a different. Yeah, I mean, there would have been a different release, I guess. It wouldn't have the anger would have drained because there would have been no pent up anything because things were good.
That's what I mean. Like there's a fickleness there. It's not like this perfect system where once something gets released, then society can move forward. But anyway, going back to Sam Harris, I think that he just doesn't like Trump, and I enjoy it a lot. It's like one of the main reasons I listen to the show. And the second he starts talking about Trump, I just get excited because it's just it feels. There's catharsis. It feels cathartic to me when I have to sit there and listen to Trump's like State of the Union address, which is like so full of like stupid stuff. It's so nice to hear somebody who's like more articulate than I am and more thoughtful than I am, like deconstruct it, and then it like completes some of the. It's like he's completing my sentences that I started writing in my head, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you think there's something fun about it too? Because since Sam is so cool as a cucumber and computer-like, it's kind of fun to see, oh, this is like something that is he's hot under the collar a little bit. Like this is something that riles him up.
Yeah, I think so too. It's out of character.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's almost like, it's like, I don't know. It's like feeding that, it's like, how much stupidity can the smart machine take?
Can't handle Trump. Trump is another level.
So anyway,
it's funny. The word democracy was like an insult for a long time. Like hundreds of years ago, it wasn't like a positive thing.
Really?
Like we think of it today. It was like it was used pejoratively, because like an aristocracy is like you have people who know what they're doing, kind of like what you were advocating for before in a different form.
Yeah.
You have experts and people who are like went to Oxford, went to the best universities. They're the only ones who are in control of kind of the machinery of state, and they make all the decisions. And democracy was like is mob rule. It's like a fancy way of describing. The majority makes a decision just because it's the majority. They have the power because there's a lot of them. So there's something like dirty and sloppy about that. And there is. This is the thing. Like there's obviously, needless to say, huge argument for democracy as opposed to having a tiny segment of people rule the majority. That doesn't make a lot of sense because on the other hand, there is a downside. I feel weird saying that, but it's totally true. There is a certain downside, which is it's possible for someone who appeals to our sloppy, more base sensibilities to get elected.
Yeah, I would think that would be helpful for democracy if we had these like little bit of like some, I don't know if you want to call it like a regulation or something, but there should be something built into the system that recognizes that when things are tough in a democracy, like things can unravel. Right? So like when
tough meaning what?
Like the economy's bad in democracy, then we're more likely to elect somebody who's going to undermine democracy. Yeah. So it'd be cool if there was something built into the system of democracy that's like, oh, maybe like when the economy like gets this low, like we have to take these actions automatically happen, or like the president isn't connected to these actions that take place. You know what I mean? So that like people can't make those wild-eyed claims like I'm gonna be the greatest like job creating president that's ever been like God ever made. Things like that.
Mean, I think the founding fathers tried to set up something that would last indefinitely or for a long time. I mean, I think they were pretty wise and knew like this stuff gets corrupted really easily. I mean, after all, they were breaking away from what they viewed as a kind of tyrannical power.
Right.
So I think they didn't want. I mean, I don't think they would approve of America today. I don't think they thought the president should have the power that they have. I think they viewed the president as kind of like a bureaucrat who was just there for a little while to sort of steer the like you're standing at the control center of the ship, but you don't really touch the controls. Like you don't have to steer it that much. The ship is kind of moving on its own with Congress and with the. I think they just viewed the federal government as sort of like an appendage to the country, but it was really like people independently living their lives that counted. And I think slowly but surely, like power tends to accumulate. You know, it's just almost like seems like a natural force or something.
Right.
So the federal government has so much power now.
I think part of it though is also like they would have never imagined a world where every country has emulated American democracy.
Mm.
You know what I mean? So that's like a big, because they were like, we're setting this thing up. We're the first ones. Okay, now and then they saw France do it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But then to be like every single country in the world, with the exception of maybe like 8 or 9 countries, are now have exactly copied the American system of democracy. So that changes how democracy has to run.
I wouldn't say that though. You think other countries have copied us that much?
Yeah. I mean, not literally copied us, but have copied like maybe the English idea of like the preamble, you know, that people have these inalienable rights and that like freedom should be viewed as precedent, and that like people shouldn't be stuck in their social class. Like most other countries have have leaned into that. You know what I mean?
I can see that.
So I'm just saying the founding fathers would have been, I think they would have had a really complex view, because they would have been like, you mean this thing we thought up in this room in, you know, Philadelphia all of a sudden is like the thing that the whole world runs upon? You know, and I don't know what they would have thought about like lobbying and all that stuff. They probably wouldn't have liked it, I'm sure, because it's not very logical. But Keith, we got to wrap up.
I know.
We've been going for a good hour and 20 minutes. We weaved Sam Harris in and out of our discussion. I think it was pretty good, though. How'd you feel about the discussion today?
Yeah, I thought it was good. I felt like he popped back up appropriately, and then we were able to kind of touch on other issues that I think we think are important.
Yeah, it's like our podcast was like weaving Sam Harris into your dialogues. So anyway, all right, everybody. So what did you think about the show today? What did we hit on? Sam Harris's good stuff? What did we miss? We talked about a lot of other things: government, spirituality, free will, determinism. Any thoughts on that? Let us know down in the comments below, or you can tweet us at @Kipp. That's my thing. Or you can hashtag Midwestern Social Scientists. Check us out on Facebook. All the different ways you can contact us. Probably the best way is if you're watching this on YouTube, though, to put a comment right down there. Hit the like button, subscribe, all that good stuff. All right, everybody. This has been episode 53 of The Social Scientists. I am Dr. Kipp Antonio.
This is Keith McIntosh saying goodbye. Bye-bye.
Hey guys, if you enjoyed the show, check out Kipp and Keith on Facebook at Midwestern Social Scientists. You can also tweet them at hashtag Midwestern Social Scientists. Or you can check out their Podomatic page, which is the first place the episodes get released. Don't miss out. Yeah, just check out their Facebook, okay? Thanks.